They called him the Scourge of God, a warlord whose name alone terrified emperors and kings, a name that became shorthand for brutality, destruction, and the wrath of heaven itself. He led a tide of warriors that erupted from the vast, mysterious steppes of the east, a force so alien and so terrifying that people thought it was a punishment sent to a sinful world. His ambition wasn't just to conquer, but to erase, to leave nothing behind but ash and memory. This is the story of a man who held the fate of a continent in his hands. It's the story of how a single brutal will brought the mighty Roman Empire, the most sophisticated power the world had ever known, to the very brink of collapse. The world in the 5th century was a fractured, fragile place, a mix of decaying empires and rising tribal confederations. But no one, not the Goths, not the Vandals, not the emperors in their marble palaces, was ready for the storm gathering on the horizon. A storm of horsemen, a storm of arrows, a storm named Attila. How did a nomadic chieftain, from a people with no cities and no written history, build an empire stretching from the Danube to the Rhine? How did he master the art of war so completely that seasoned Roman legions trembled at his approach? And how, in just a few short, bloody years, did he come so close to extinguishing the light of Western civilization? This is the story of Attila the Hun. To get Attila, you first have to get the Huns. For centuries, they were little more than a whisper on the edge of the civilized world. A ghost people from the vast, unending grasslands of Central Asia. Roman and Greek historians wrote about them with a mix of fear and morbid fascination. They were described as a people born on horseback, who lived, ate, slept, and even held meetings in the saddle, and they looked just as terrifying as they sounded. Short, squat, with broad chests and large heads, their faces were said to be scarred from ritual cuts made in infancy that stopped them from growing beards, leaving them with an unnervingly smooth, almost inhuman look. There's a tantalizing theory, though it's still debated by modern historians, that these were the same people as the Xiongnu, the relentless horsemen who terrorized China's Han dynasty for centuries and helped inspire the construction of the Great Wall. Pushed west by their old enemies, they vanished from Chinese records, only to reappear centuries later on the doorstep of Europe. Around 370 AD, this tide of nomadic warriors crashed across the Volga River. They were a force of nature. Their main weapon was the composite reflex bow, a marvel of engineering made of wood, horn, and sinew that could punch an arrow through Roman armor from 100 yards away. Their tactics were a terrifying symphony of chaos and control, swarming attacks, fake retreats, and endless volleys of arrows that blackened the sky. They didn't conquer in the Roman sense, they consumed. The Alans, a fierce warrior people themselves, were the first to be swallowed. Then the Huns fell on the Goths. Panicked and broken, thousands of Goths fled across the Danube River seeking refuge inside the Roman Empire, an event that triggered a domino effect of chaos, culminating in the sack of Rome itself in 410. The Huns hadn't even gotten there yet, but their shadow was already falling over the empire. They settled in the great Hungarian plain, a perfect pasture for their massive herds of horses and a staging ground to strike in any direction. They were a problem, a dangerous one, but not yet an existential threat. For that, they needed a leader, someone who could unite their chaotic energy and focus their destructive power. That king was about to be born. Sometime around the year 406, in the heart of this new Hunnic domain, a boy named Attila was born into the Hunnic elite. His father was the brother of the ruling kings. Now this wasn't the brutish, savage childhood a Roman might picture. Attila and his older brother Bleda were princes of the most powerful force outside the Roman and Persian empires. They were trained from the moment they could walk to be the ultimate Hunnic warriors, masters of the horse, the bow, the sword, and the lasso. But their education went further. They learned Gothic and Latin, the languages of their enemies. They were taught military strategy and, just as important, diplomacy. They were being groomed not just as warriors, but as kings. Attila's youth was also shaped by Rome more directly. He would have known of Flavius Aetius, a young Roman noble who spent time as a political hostage among the Huns. This gave Aetius an unmatched understanding of Hunnic warfare, knowledge that would one day make him one of Rome's greatest generals. It also means that Aetius and the future Hunnic king likely knew each other as young men, a shared history that would one day lead to a cataclysmic battle for Europe's fate. Attila grew up in a world where Rome wasn't an unconquerable giant, but a source of immense wealth to be shaken down. He saw how his uncles used the threat of war to bleed the Eastern Roman Empire of its gold. He saw how their internal squabbles made them vulnerable. He was learning, watching, and waiting. The old world was dying. A new age was dawning, an age of iron, blood, and fire. In 434, the Hunnic kings died, and their sprawling domain, stretching from the Rhine River to the Caucasus, fell to their two nephews, Bleda and Attila. They inherited not just a kingdom, but a war machine. The Huns ruled a vast collection of vassal peoples, Goths, Gepids, Alans, and more, a diverse confederation held together by fear and the promise of loot. Bleda, the older brother, was technically the senior ruler, but right from the start, it was Attila's ambition that burned brightest. One of their first moves was to face the Romans, not on the battlefield, but at the negotiating table. They met the ambassadors of the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius II near the city of Margus. In a pure power move, Attila and Bleda refused to get off their horses, forcing the Roman envoys to talk business while looking up at them from the ground. The message was clear: "We are not your equals." The resulting Treaty of Margus in 435 was a total humiliation for Constantinople. The Romans agreed to double their annual tribute to 700 pounds of gold. They promised not to ally with any of the Huns' enemies and to return all Hunnic refugees. This wasn't a treaty, it was extortion on an imperial scale. For Attila, it was a lesson in power. Rome would pay for peace, and that made them pray. With their western flank secured by a river of gold, the brothers turned east, toward the wealthy Sassanid Empire in Persia. The campaign was a rare failure. The rugged Armenian highlands weren't the open plains where Hunnic cavalry dominated, and the Sassanids beat them back. That failure was a crucial turning point. Rebuffed in the east, Attila and Bleda turned their armies back toward Europe, their appetite for plunder stronger than ever. Their new target was the very empire that was paying them to stay away. In 440, the Huns found their excuse. They accused the Bishop of Margus of digging up royal Hunnic graves and demanded he be handed over. When the Romans hesitated, Attila struck. This was no mere border raid. It was a full-scale invasion, and the timing was perfect. The main Eastern Roman army was away in Sicily, preparing to fight the Vandals in North Africa. The Balkan provinces were practically defenseless. The Huns stormed across the Danube in 441, unleashing a fury the Romans had never seen. They sacked the great frontier cities, Viminacium, Singidunum, modern Belgrade, and Margus itself. The bishop who started it all, terrified, secretly opened the city gates to the Huns to save his own skin. The city was plundered and burned to the ground. The Huns showed a terrifying new skill. They were no longer just nomadic raiders. They had learned the art of siege warfare, probably from captured Roman engineers. Now they used massive battering rams and siege towers to crack open fortified cities that had once been safe. Emperor Theodosius II panicked and recalled his troops, but it was too little, too late. In 443, Attila launched a second, even more devastating campaign. He drove deep into the Balkans, crushing a Roman army near Constantinople itself. He sacked city after city, leaving a trail of absolute destruction. Theodosius was forced to beg for peace. The new treaty was even worse. The annual tribute was tripled to an insane 2,100 pounds of gold. A huge back payment was demanded, and a vast strip of Roman land south of the Danube was to be cleared of all Roman forces, creating a desolate no-man's land. Attila was now the master of the Balkans. Then, around 445, the brotherly co-op came to a sudden bloody end. The historical accounts are thin, but the result is clear. Bleda died and Attila became the sole undisputed king of the Huns. The Roman historian Priscus, who later visited Attila's court, states bluntly that Attila murdered his brother. With Bleda gone, nothing could restrain Attila's ambition. All the power of the Hunnic Confederation was now in the hands of one man, a man who had just brought the Eastern Roman Empire to its knees. And with the East bled dry, Attila's gaze and the eyes of his unstoppable army began to turn west. Towards Gaul, towards Italy, and towards the ultimate prize, Rome itself. With his brother out of the picture, and the Hunnic tribes united under his iron fist, Attila was more than a king. He was the emperor of a vast, mobile empire. He ruled not from a stone capital, but from a sprawling camp of tents and wooden halls on the plains of Hungary. It was from here in 447 that he decided the Eastern Romans still hadn't learned their lesson. The new emperor in Constantinople, Marcian, had defiantly stopped paying the crippling tribute. For Attila, that was an insult that could only be answered with fire. He unleashed his horsemen on the Balkans again, in a campaign even more ferocious than the last. The Roman field army met the Huns at the Battle of the Utus River in modern-day Bulgaria. The battle was a bloodbath. The Romans fought desperately, and sources say losses were catastrophic on both sides. The Roman general himself was killed. In the end, the Roman army was shattered. The path into the heart of the Eastern Empire was wide open. Attila's horde swept through the provinces, reportedly sacking over 70 cities. They reached the very gates of Constantinople, stopping only because the city's massive walls, recently repaired after an earthquake, were too much even for them. Besides, his own army had been badly hurt in the battle. He couldn't take the capital, but he had made his point. The terrified Romans again sued for peace, agreeing to resume the tribute. Attila had broken the back of the Eastern Roman army. He was now, without question, the most feared man in the world, the flagellum Dei, the scourge of God. And now his eyes turned west. The Western Roman Empire was a hollowed-out shell, plagued by power struggles and barbarian attacks. But it was still incredibly rich, and for Attila it was a golden opportunity. He just needed a reason to attack. And in 450, he got one, delivered in what has to be one of the weirdest and most consequential messages in history. It came from Justa Grata Honoria, the sister of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III. Honoria was an ambitious imperial woman, trapped in a gilded cage. Furious at being forced into a dull marriage, she took a wild gamble. She sent a trusted servant to Attila begging for help, and included her engagement ring. What did she mean by it? A rescue? An alliance? A plot to overthrow her brother? We'll never know for sure. But Attila, always the opportunist, chose to interpret it in the most dramatic way possible, as a marriage proposal. He accepted, and as his new bride's dowry, he demanded half of the Western Roman Empire. Valentinian was horrified and furious. He refused. For Attila, that refusal was the perfect excuse. Honoria's ring was all the justification he needed. In the spring of 451, Attila gathered a colossal army of his Huns and tens of thousands of warriors from his subject peoples, Ostrogoths, Gepids, Franks, and more. This immense force crossed the Rhine River and poured into Gaul. The invasion was an avalanche of destruction. Cities like Metz were razed, their people slaughtered. The horde moved with terrifying speed, burning everything in its path. Paris was said to have been saved only by the prayers of Saint Genevieve. Attila's main target was Aurelianum, modern-day Orléans. Its position on the Loire River would give him a base to strike anywhere in Gaul. But the West had a defender, the one man who truly understood the Hunnic threat, Flavius Aetius. The same Aetius who had spent his youth with the Huns was now their greatest enemy. Aetius was the Magister Militum, the master of soldiers, and the real power in the Western Empire. He knew his Roman forces weren't enough to stop Attila, so he needed allies. In a masterstroke of diplomacy born of pure desperation, he forged an unlikely coalition with his old enemy, Theodoric I, king of the Visigoths. Aetius convinced Theodoric that Attila was a threat to everyone in Gaul, Goth, and Roman alike. Joined by Franks, Burgundians, and Alans, this patchwork army of bitter rivals marched to save Orléans and confront the scourge of God. They arrived just in time. The siege was broken, and Attila, denied his prize, was forced to retreat. Aetius and Theodoric gave chase. Near the city of Troyes, on a vast rolling plain known as the Catalaunian Fields, Attila turned to fight. On June 20th, 451, two of the largest armies of the ancient world faced off on the Catalaunian Plains. This was more than a battle. It was a clash of worlds. On one side, Attila and his confederation of Huns and German vassals. On the other, Aetius and his fragile alliance of Romans and their own German allies. It was a dizzying collection of peoples who had spent the last century fighting each other, now united against a common foe. Aetius, the master strategist, knew the terrain. He put his own Roman troops on the left wing and the powerful but less reliable Visigoths on the right, under their aging king Theodoric. And in the center, in a brilliant if cynical move, he placed the Alans, whose loyalty was shaky at best. He essentially surrounded them, giving them no choice but to fight. The historian Jordanes, who gives us the most vivid account, says Attila rallied his warriors before the battle, mocking the Romans' conglomeration of dissonant races and urging his men to seek vengeance. Then he ordered the attack. The fighting was savage from the start. Both sides scrambled to take a ridge that dominated the field. Aetius's Romans and Theodoric's son, Thorismund, got there first, throwing back the initial Hunnic assault. The battle then dissolved into a chaotic, swirling melee across a front several miles long. It was a maelstrom of screaming men, terrified horses, and the brutal clang of steel on steel. Jordanes wrote that a stream running through the battlefield became so swollen with blood that the thirsty and wounded were forced to drink a gruesome mix of water and gore. In the thick of the fight, King Theodoric was struck down while urging his men forward. Some say he was thrown from his horse and trampled, others that he was killed by an enemy spear. But his death, which should have broken the Visigothic line, did the exact opposite. Enraged by the loss of their king, the Visigoths, now led by his son Thorismund, launched a furious assault, carving a bloody path straight for Attila himself. For the first time in his life, Attila was in mortal danger. The Visigothic charge nearly broke through to him. He was forced to pull back to his camp, a defensive circle of wagons. As night fell, the Huns were trapped and surrounded, nursing horrific losses. Attila was so sure the end had come that he ordered a massive funeral pyre built from wooden saddles, ready to throw himself into the flames rather than be captured. But as dawn broke, the final blow never came. Aetius, always playing 4D chess, made a cold calculation. He feared that if the Huns were completely destroyed, his Visigothic allies would become the new dominant power in Gaul, a problem potentially bigger than Attila. So he convinced the new Visigothic king, Thorismund, that he needed to race back to his capital to secure his throne from his brothers. Thorismund agreed and led his army away. Aetius had won. He had stopped the unstoppable. He let a battered Attila retreat with what was left of his army back across the Rhine. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains was Attila's first and only major defeat. The aura of his invincibility was shattered. The cost was staggering. While ancient sources claim up to 300,000 casualties, which modern historians doubt, it was undeniably one of the bloodiest days in European history. Aetius had saved Gaul, but the scourge of God wasn't finished. He had been defeated, but he was still alive. And now he wanted revenge. A defeated Attila was arguably more dangerous than a victorious one. The humiliation of the Catalaunian Plains festered. In 452, just 1 year later, he was back for blood. He had rebuilt his army, but this time he wouldn't risk facing another coalition in Gaul. He chose a new target, the heart of the Western Empire, Italy itself. He led his army across the Julian Alps and descended into the rich plains of northern Italy. The invasion was a whirlwind of terror. Aetius, his forces depleted, could do little to stop him. The campaign began with the siege of Aquileia, a large, wealthy city on the Adriatic coast. The city resisted for 3 months, but Attila's siege engines finally broke through. Enraged by the delay, Attila ordered the city to be razed so completely that a century later it was hard to find where it had even stood. Legend says that the desperate survivors fled into the nearby marshy lagoons, founding settlements in a place that would one day grow into the magnificent Republic of Venice. The destruction of Aquileia sent a wave of panic across Italy. Attila's horde stormed through the Po Valley, sacking cities like Padua and Verona. In Milan, he mockingly sat on the imperial throne. The road to Rome was open. The city was gripped by helpless terror. The emperor had fled, and Aetius's army was nowhere in sight. It seemed the end had come for the eternal city. And then something remarkable happened. As Attila's army camped by a river near Mantua, a strange embassy arrived from Rome. It wasn't led by a general, but by a bishop, Pope Leo I, one of the most commanding figures of the early church. So, what did this unarmed man of God say to the most feared warlord on earth? The details have been wrapped in legend for centuries. A famous fresco by Raphael depicts the apostles Peter and Paul appearing in the sky with swords, terrifying Attila into submission. The reality was likely more down to earth. Leo probably showed up with a giant pile of Roman gold. But that wasn't the only thing on Attila's mind. His own army was in trouble. Italy was suffering from a famine, and supplies were running dangerously low. Disease, probably dysentery and malaria, was sweeping through his camp. Plus, he got word that the Eastern Emperor had sent an army across the Danube to attack the Hunnic heartlands. And perhaps most importantly, Attila was notoriously superstitious. He knew that Alaric, the Visigoth who sacked Rome in 410, had died very shortly after. He feared the same fate. For a mix of all these reasons, the Pope's persuasion, the gold, the disease, the threat to his homeland, and his own fears, Attila did the unthinkable. He turned his army around and left Italy. Rome was saved. Attila retreated back across the Danube, still threatening to return. But he would never get the chance. In early 453, Attila decided to take another wife, a young woman named Ildiko. The wedding was celebrated with a massive feast and heavy drinking. That night, the great king, the scourge of God, retired to his wedding bed. The next morning, his attendants grew worried when he didn't appear. They broke down the doors and found a shocking scene. Attila was dead. He was lying on his back with no sign of a wound while his new bride wept in terror. In his drunken sleep, he had suffered a severe nosebleed and choked to death on his own blood. The most feared man in the world, who had brought empires to their knees, had died not in a glorious battle, but in a quiet, bizarre, and deeply anticlimactic accident. His warriors, upon finding him, cut their hair and slashed their faces with swords, mourning their great leader not with tears, but with the blood of men. Attila's campaigns redrew the map of Europe, and his name has echoed through the centuries. To understand how the world reeled and reformed after his death, and to explore more stories of the figures who shaped our world, make sure you subscribe and hit the notification bell for more epic history. The death of Attila was the death of the Hunnic Empire. The vast confederation he had held together through sheer force of will immediately began to fall apart. His sons squabbled over their inheritance and fought amongst themselves. Seeing their chance, their subjugated peoples, led by Ardaric of the Gepids, rose in rebellion. At the Battle of Nidau in 454, the Huns were crushed, and Attila's favorite son, Elac, was killed. The empire disintegrated as quickly as it had formed. Within a generation, the Huns had vanished from history, absorbed into the other tribes of Europe. Yet the scourge of God left an indelible mark on the world. His invasions were a brutal catalyst, accelerating the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. He shattered its armies, drained its treasuries, and exposed its terminal weakness. The power vacuum left by the Huns' sudden disappearance only created more chaos, allowing other groups to carve out kingdoms from the dying corpse of the West. Just 2 decades after Attila's death, the last Western Roman emperor was deposed, marking the traditional end of an era. In the centuries that followed, Attila became a legend. In medieval Europe, he was the literal scourge of God. Later, for nations like Hungary, he was transformed into a mythical founding father. He was a destroyer, a unifier, a ruthless tactician, and a shrewd diplomat. He built no lasting cities, laws, or institutions. He left behind a legacy of fear and destruction, but also a profound and terrifying reminder of how fragile civilization can be. He was a storm that erupted from the east, raged across a continent, and then, just as suddenly, was gone, leaving a transformed world in his wake.